You train their military leaders here. You exhibit presence. You cooperate with their militaries. You respond to crises. You do joint exercises. You pre-position equipment over there. You have permanent bases, alliances. Sometimes you go all the way to an occupation. My point is, you don't measure it in terms of bombs dropped. You measure it in terms of the attention we pay regions. Start wrapping it up. We master this new definition of crisis and instability so we understand how to wage war within the context of everything else. We screw up any one of these flows, we could screw up the system. We have destroyed globalization before, and we can definitely do it again. We have to understand that when we wage war, we administer to a system. I see it as a three-pronged strategy. 1, strengthen the core's ability to withstand system perturbations like 9/11. 2, firewall the core off from the gap's worst exports. 3, you got to shrink the gap. Only a small portion of it involves military actions. The vast bulk of it is foreign direct investment. The vast bulk. Here's the stuff that gets the most play now in the book, which frankly I wasn't going to put into the book because I thought it was a little too far out there. But events in Iraq make it a lot more relevant. Make an argument, again, another stretching one. Difference between defense and security. Historically, defense means take care of the homeland. And as Art Sabrowski likes to say, security means everything else. I could do this for $100 billion. We spend $350 billion over here. Historically, we had two different forces to do that. It's written in the Constitution. Raise an army, maintain a navy. Your big stick force, your baton stick force with the Marines. Your can of whoop-ass, how you keep the system functioning. We decided in 1947 to put those two together. Why? Because we believed, correctly, we were going to be involved in a long-term hair-trigger standoff with the Soviets. And so we merged the definition of America's national defense and the whole world going up in flames. Won't argue with that definition. Problem is, that definition no longer holds. What has happened since the end of the Cold War? What has happened is basically that bifurcation I described earlier. Operating one military, buying another. Gets harder over time. It'll get very hard over the next year in Iraq. Very hard. We've been having these arguments ever since the end of the Cold War. Let's go back to what we had before. As somebody at the Naval War College, we like the idea. Some people think 9/11 really triggered the bifurcation. Home game, Homeland Security. Away game, Department of Defense. I believe the creation of the Department of Homeland Security was a strategic error. I don't think it's going to increase coordination whatsoever. I think we're going to waste a lot of money. We're going to feel good about it. But any notion of putting up walls between us and the outside world is a waste of time. The shock of 9/11 should have pushed us into embracing the world, not pulling back from the world. I knew when we went into Iraq, we would defeat the Iraq army with ease, and that we'd probably screw up the occupation badly. Why? Because we don't have a back half force. And because we don't have a back half force, we don't get those 17,000 peacekeepers from India, which basically says, you know what? I don't think you got it. I think the occupation of Iraq is transforming transformation. And I think it's about time we admit that we have, living uncomfortably inside the Department of Defense, both a Department of War and a Department of everything else. I think Don Rumsfeld is an amazing Secretary of War. I don't think we have a Secretary for everything else. And that's how you get Abu Ghraib. That's how you get all the screw-ups in Iraq. We don't have a Secretary for everything else. Two missions fundamentally at odds. We need a Leviathan force for that Hobbesian world called the Gap. That force is going to win you wars. We also need a peace-waging force. The back half force. What's amazing is, when our forces get to do this stuff, they come back with very high re-enlistment rates. They feel very good about sysadmin work. So don't tell me we can't find the people for that right-hand force, because I know we can. But you can't take them under the circumstances of this, especially the reserve component, then send them over for extended duties, and oh, by the way, you might have to slip back into this, because we didn't shut down the war very effectively. Other differences. The Leviathan force has traditional partners who all look suspiciously like the United Kingdom and their former colonies, which is without surprise. They're multinational states, like in India, like a Canada, Australia, United States. These partners, much different, much wider array. This is your jointness. This is so much more. Interagency. I call this your dad's military. I call this your mom's military. Your dad's military, Leviathan force, I want them young, male, unmarried, slightly pissed off. They like Nintendo, I say, great. I got a 9-year-old they can have right now. This is going to be older, married with children, more educated, gender balanced. This one is not coming under the purview of the International Criminal Court. This one is. This one will not move in the direction of civilian law, but remain very distinct from society and military law. This one will move in the direction of civilian law, become more like cops. This one will respect the restrictions, posse comitatus, military forces operating inside the United States. This force is going to obliterate those distinctions over time. These are the ground troops for your Northern Command. Leviathan force will not hold press conferences. Sysadmin force will be open source. Different definitions of network. And then the command arrangements. This is how you make sense of Dana Priest's work. Washington Post. They're your proconsuls. They've been doing sysadmin around the world for years. All we have to do is admit it. You're combatant commanders, the biggest foreign policy budgets in the US government, dwarfing that estate. And then look at what the Vice Chairman, Peter Pace, is doing in terms of long-term war planning. You're going to see that war-fighting force drawn back into these previously supporting commands. You're going to see that force commanded increasingly by a Joint Forces Command. And that's going to be the big stick we break out every so often. Whereas this is the force that's never coming home. And then Special Ops, distinct from Marine Corps. They are really your assassination squad, they're your leave behind force, they're your first in, last out. That's how it breaks down. Last slide. Definition of transformation. Art Zabrowski likes to say it's a three-headed monster. Inside the Pentagon, it's mostly about buying stuff. That's what the Hill cares about. To hell with your vision, do you build it in my district? Inside the E-ring, it's all about running the Defense Department better. The revolution in business affairs. This is the one that's really changing. The role of the Defense Department in national security. Best question I ever got in response to this brief came from Esquire staff. Asked the question, in your vision of the future, what changes more? These are the answers we came up with. We think the rest of the world is going to change more than the United States. It's not about building Fortress America. It's about raising security practices outside, which is why I believe in the virtual border concept. And I believe in tracking containers at where they start, not where they come. Private sector is going to change a whole lot more than the public sector. Private sector has a hard time with security as a collective good. They consider it a sunk cost. They hate it. You want to see a good example of private sector security? It's called security at airports before 9/11. The U.S. government as a whole is going to change more than the Defense Department. These guys have to aggregate a lot of disparate skill sets. All I'm talking about in this bifurcation is returning to what we know throughout our history. Interagency is going to change a whole lot more than jointness. Interagency is the new jointness. Interagency is going to change a whole lot more than jointness. Interagency is the new jointness. Peacekeeping is going to change a whole lot more than warfighting, which is still about smoking holes. And military operations are going to change a whole lot more than what we buy or how we buy it. Now, we send the defense budget over to the Hill. We call it a transformation budget. And the military expenditure force structure weenies come out of their little cubby holes in the think tanks around Washington. And they say, I'm a transformation expert. And I say, how do we know you're a transformation expert? They say, I've memorized every line of the U.S. defense budget. That makes me a transformation expert. So they say, I've gone through your defense budget. I've looked at every line. I don't see transformation anywhere. Show me where it is. We say, maybe you need a larger perspective. Because maybe there's all sorts of change going on throughout the system. But you're not paying attention to it because you only define it in terms of programs of record. The whack list. And that has to end if we're going to understand transformation, if we're going to understand the seam between war and peace, if we're going to succeed in reaching a finishing line in this global war on terrorism, which I'll define as making globalization truly global, connecting the disconnected, ending the threat as we know it.